Punk rock is an interesting phenomenon in the history of rock music. It is a real return to simplicity movement that bubbles in a kind of underground scene, not sort of way off the radar during the first half of the 1970s, and then kind of explodes onto the scene first in the UK in 1977 with the Sex Pistols, and then in this country at the end of 77 into 1978 with a whole series of groups that we'll talk about here. New Wave becomes the kind of adaptation of the punk attitude. But the thing about punk music is that it is a real pushback against these ideas of professionalism and musical ambition and these kinds of things that are part of the hippie aesthetic. So when we return to talk about the decade, we'll link punk in many ways with disco as being a kind of rejection of the hippie aesthetic and part of what really brings the sort of hippie rock or hippie aesthetic rock that I've been talking about to a close. Punk plays an important role in that. And while we talk about the Sex Pistols as being the first important group to really sort of break through in the punk style, the roots of punk really go back to the United States and really to the late 1960s. As we talk about punk, we'll want to keep an eye on the idea that punk is a music about confrontation. It's a music about sort of rejecting the status quo, not only culturally, but also musically, as I said, with regard to issues of professionalism in this. So let's keep our eyes on that as we continue to talk about the scene in the US and the UK. So we start with the US because that's really where punk gets its start, although as a bit of an underground scene first. Here are some of the early influential bands, and I know a lot of people who've been watching these videos are wondering, why doesn't he say something about the Velvet Underground? And we were talking about the late 60s, why didn't he say something about the Velvet Underground and the albums there and all that? Well, because in the period of psychedelia, the Velvet Underground had some influence, but not nearly the influence that a lot of the other groups that we talked about during that period did. In fact, one of the ways in which we gauge the importance of the Velvet Underground is how much subsequent influence they had on later kind of acts. And so now is the time to really consider that music from the late 1960s, because what it really does is lead in a very clear way to the New York punk scene that eventually makes its way to the UK and then makes its way back to this country again. So here's where the Velvet Underground story really fits in best, I think. The Velvet Underground formed by songwriter Lou Reed, who'd been a kind of commercial songwriter in New York in the 1960s, and John Cale, who had studied avant-garde music and was very well versed in avant-garde aesthetics and ideas of what was happening in the most cutting-edge classical music, formed this group together and called the Velvet Underground. And initially, they're associated with the artist Andy Warhol in the mid-1960s. You may know Andy Warhol's some of his art because it's kind of you find it everywhere in our culture. There's the Campbell soup cans painting. There's the Marilyn Monroe painting. The idea of taking things that are familiar from our culture, things that we see all the same time, and recontextualizing them in interesting kinds of ways. That's a lot of what Andy Warhol was trying to do with his approach to pop art. He would have these musical happenings. Now this sounds very kind of psychedelic, late 60s, right? These kinds of artistic happenings, but rather than, tie-dye and sort of hippie philosophy and that kind of thing. These were more sort of aesthetic, uptown, sort of cultural, on the cusp of artistic development kind of events. And one of them was something called the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, which toured around a bit in 1966 and 1967, and the Velvet Underground did music for those happenings that were sort of multimedia kinds of events that Andy Warhol was behind. Part of this results in the album from 1967, the famous one with the banana on it, called The Velvet Underground and Nico. I don't think Nico was the band's idea. I think that was Andy Warhol's idea. But nevertheless, tracks like Heroin and Venus in Furs were very dark. They were very realistic. They were very existential in certain kinds of way, and didn't really resonate with the happy flower power kind of vibe of the day. Although when you compare what the Velvet Underground were doing with what the Doors were trying to do in LA with the sort of darker side of psychedelia, I think you find some real kinship there, at least aesthetically, even if the music really sounds quite different. You can see they were trying to explore the darker side of the drug world, some of the seedier, maybe sort of off the radar subculture kinds of elements of it. Nevertheless, this music became increasingly influential to artists who would follow them. Other sort of early kind of punk bands, Iggy Pop, coming out of Detroit, his album The Stooges, his band The Stooges, their big album called Funhouse from 1970. Iggy Pop was very influenced by Lou Reed, although I don't know if it's the best compliment in the world. Iggy Reed said, I heard the Velvet Underground and I thought, that guy can't sing, I can't sing, I want to do music. I don't know what Lou Reed would have to say about that, but nevertheless, Iggy Pop at every opportunity tells people about the influence of the Velvet Underground on his music. Anyway, Iggy Pop in Detroit, a kind of a crazy performer who would do all kinds of things, smear his body with peanut butter and walk out into the crowd and have them hold him up with their hands. And I mean, the live shows were a real happening, that's for sure. Also in Detroit, we've got the MC5, who in 1969 released this album, Kick Out the Jams, with a lot of sort of raw, aggressive energy, sometimes mixed with profanity, as in the famous Kick Out the Jams, and then there's a word that follows that I probably shouldn't use here. They were kind of managed by John Sinclair, but John Sinclair was so dedicated to left-wing causes that he refused to say that he managed the group because that seemed too controlling. Nevertheless, he got them very involved and associated with left-wing politics to the extent that he even wrote a blurb on the album that was somewhat controversial. Anyway, the MC5 and Iggy Pop really standing for a kind of raw, aggressive approach to music that was very much against what we see happening with the groups that are popular at the time, who are driven by the hippie aesthetic and ideas of professionalism and polish. Even when they're being gritty, they're being polished about it. Here, these guys were, when they were being gritty, they were being gritty. A group that kind of creates a connection between the Velvet Underground and what happens in the New York punk scene in the 1970s is the New York Dolls, led by singer David Johansen. 2 albums, one from 1973 simply called The New York Dolls, and one from 1974 called Too Much, Too Soon. They are kind of glam meets the gritty city. I mean, these are guys that were some of the first musicians to sort of put on lipstick and wigs and dresses and do very, cowboy outfits. I mean, they sort of really sort of dressed it up in ways that were designed really to kind of seem weird and shocking in various kinds of ways. But so there was a kind of almost kind of underworld, but I don't mean crime underworld, I mean like sort of sexual, drunken, drug underworld kind of tone to a lot of what they were doing. Never had very big success, but they were very important to a number of artists who were also looking to the Velvet Underground and to Iggy Pop and the MC5 for inspiration. David Johansen and the New York Dolls are important in many ways because not only for how they influenced groups in the New York scene that we're going to talk about now, but when we talk in the next video about UK punk, the New York Dolls are going to play an important role in that, but I'll save that for the next video. So now we come to New York, and what we really think of as the roots of the punk scene in New York. This is in many ways primarily situated around a single club, the legendary CBGB, CBGB standing for Country, Bluegrass, and Blues. There's another club named Max's Kansas City, which was also part of this, but CBGB is usually thought of as the big club. When these groups started trying to do what they were doing for punk music, the best they could do at first, since they didn't expect that they would draw much of a crowd, is to get a Sunday night at CBGB, which wasn't really a very highfalutin bar to begin with. And Sunday nights, what's the bar owner got to lose? I mean, there's not going to be anybody in there. If they can bring a couple friends in to drink, the bands can play. They're not going to get paid anything. So some of those early punk events with groups like Patti Smith and Television and the Ramones and Blondie and Talking Heads all together were basically the bands, the other bands, and their girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever, and a couple of friends, and that's basically who was in the club. Not unlike a lot of indie music clubs today, but that's really what was going on. It was very much an underground scene at the same time as Led Zeppelin and Yes and Jethro Tull and the Allman Brothers and all these other groups are having all this success on the charts. There's this small club in New York where this is happening and starting to come together. So some of the groups that we talk about with regard to the New York scene, Patti Smith Group, featuring not only Patti Smith, more of a poet maybe than a singer ultimately, but very much a poet, teaming together with Lenny Kaye, a music journalist who, and not only a music journalist, but also a guitarist who worked with Patti Smith. And Lenny Kaye also put together a collection of garage band singles called Nuggets, which was released on Elektra Records in the early 1970s and became kind of the way in which a lot of people came to know garage band music again. Garage band became a very big influence on the punk scene during this time. Anyway, the album from 1975, Horses, had mild commercial success. The song Gloria was heard on the radio a bit. Another one of these CBGB groups, Television, was formed by Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine. They didn't record during the first half of the 70s when a lot of this was coming together. Their first big album, Marquee Moon from 1977, never had the kind of commercial success that a lot of these other groups had. Neither did the Ramones. For as influential as the Ramones were, they took on stage names, Joey, Johnny, Dee Dee, and Tommy Ramone. That first album from 1976 on Sire Records, the Ramones had the song Blitzkrieg Bop. Now that gets played over and over again. People go around with Ramones t-shirts, but it's important to understand that in the 1970s, the Ramones, outside of that punk community, were largely unknown. They became known later, but at this time, they were largely unknown. And when other groups like Patti Smith and Blondie and Talking Heads would go on to have big commercial success out of this CBGB scene, groups like Television and the Ramones did not so much have that success, but they were very much a part of forming the aesthetic around New York punk, around CBGB. And we've already mentioned Blondie. I'll just say a word about them because we'll come back to them again when we talk about New Wave, but fronted by Deborah Harry, obviously doing a kind of Marilyn Monroe kind of thing. The way in which the New Wave artists took the past and sort of put it in ironic quotation marks. We'll get to that, and Blondie is a very big part of that. Anyway, they had their big success in their first big success in 1978 with the album Parallel Lines, but we'll get to that when we talk about New Wave a little bit later in one of the other lectures. As we move away from the New York scene now, we'll be moving away from it at a time when nobody really knew about it unless you went down to those clubs and saw what was going on. We'll move over to the UK now. Say just a word about punk fashion, which is part of that subculture, included things like ripped jeans, leather jackets, the commonly used safety pin in all kinds of different places on the clothes and on the body, and the sort of the trademark hairstyle being the mohawk, sometimes dyed in outrageous colors. There was a kind of DIY aesthetic, or do-it-yourself. A lot of these groups did everything themselves, the recording, the promotion. Everything was done essentially on a small scale, not very corporate, not very really even organized much out of their own area. All right, so that gets us through the New York scene. Again, as I say, still pretty unknown. Now we're going to get to the UK scene where we talk about the rise of the Sex Pistols. And were it not for this New York scene that I'm talking about, the scene with the Sex Pistols in the UK would never have happened. That's what we'll talk about in the next video.